Chapter 9, Gloces, a canyon in the Spanish Pyrenees by Wim Hof. Our bus had just departed from Leiden, a city famous for its old university. All around me, filling the seats, were 16 and 17-year-old students. I was sitting in the back of the bus, speaking to one of the professors about the book that she had just published. I told her that I had also recently written and published a book of my own. It was a long drive full of conversation and laughter. We drove through the southern part of Holland, Belgium, and most of France. As the night approached, everyone fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The following morning, when we had reached the southern part of France, we stopped at a rest stop for 15 minutes so that everyone could get out of their seats and use the restroom. And while everyone did their own thing, I walked to the other side of the parking lot just to stretch my legs. And as I began to walk back, I saw the bus leaving without me. I tried to get the attention of the bus driver by running and waving my hands violently, but my attempt failed. No one on the bus must have realized that I was gone because it just pulled away without me. I thought to myself, surely they'll notice that I am missing at some point and turn back for me. I waited and waited, but the bus didn't come back. It had left me behind. Apparently, the professor whom I had previously been speaking with had gone to a different seat on the bus to sleep. She never realized my seat was left vacant after our restroom break. As for everyone else, they too were just busy doing their own thing to realize my absence. It wasn't until they were about 400 kilometers from the rest stop when someone first recognized my absence. Once I acknowledged the fact that they just weren't coming back, I decided to hitchhike. Half an hour passed before a car finally stopped, and my travels could finally continue. It went that way from one car to another until I finally reached the Pyrenees in Spain. It was a strange way to travel, but it worked for me. I didn't have my rucksack, and it was still on the bus. The only thing I had on me was my passport. Yet somehow, things seemed to work out in my favor. A random stranger, once I told him of my predicament, just offered to rent me a hotel room for the night and pay for my dinner. Just, wow, that's nice. The following day, I continued my hitchhiking in 3 different cars. I spoke enthusiastically with the drivers about all kinds of things: the weather, the mountains, the geological structure of the canyons, and even philosophy. After a long journey, I finally arrived in the Pyrenees. It was an unexpected yet exciting adventure. When I had finally arrived at the camping site in Spain, I met up with the group again. They were extremely surprised to see me. Reunited, we set out on our adventure. They were ready to embark on what we had traveled there to do, to rappel the canyons and see beautiful sights. Our first stop would be a canyon named El Gloces. El Gloces is a wet canyon in the Pyrenees. A lot of water passes through the canyon, and people that venture there tend to get very wet. The water that flows down is typically cold because it drains from the high mountains. Therefore, wetsuits are used as a precaution when rappelling El Gloces. With everyone prepared in their wetsuits, fashioned with rucksacks, belts, and ropes, we made our way to the canyon. From there, we started abseiling our way through the labyrinth of rocks and water. The path inside the canyon was a narrow one with steep walls. It was extremely dark, but a beautiful sight. To get through the canyon, we had to jump into pools of water, swim, balance on boulders, cross large rocks and crevices, jump gaps, and rappel into the abyss. Everyone had a lot of fun, despite the cold water that sprayed against us every step of the way. After many thrilling hours of canyoning, we arrived at the bottom. From there, we had to walk for another hour up the mountain to get back to the parked bus. Everyone was exhausted, but our spirits were high. That night, we all went to a local pub to enjoy each other's company while we ate good food and drank good wine. Everyone enjoyed the impression that nature had pressed upon us that day. Even the professors had enjoyed themselves. While in the pub, a wave of excitement washed over me. I suggested that we go back to the canyon right in the moment and do it all again. This time, we would do it in the dark. Another adventure. The students were overwhelmed with excitement and were ready to go. However, the professors shut down my offer. Since the teachers felt responsible for the students' safety, they did not want them to go on the risky adventure. Canyoning in the dark is extremely dangerous and could potentially have fatal consequences if one isn't careful. However, the idea was already locked into my mind, and apparently one of the gym teachers who happily agreed to go with me. Since the water in the canyon was going to be colder than it was earlier that day, the gym teacher completely covered himself up with his wetsuit. Only the front part of his face was exposed. I simply went in shorts. I was feeling great after the bottle of wine, and within a couple hours, we were running over the stony path toward the canyon. The canyon looked very different at night. The trees and the rocks cast immense shadows against the earth. It wasn't intimidating, just different. As we arrived at the beginning of the canyon, we saw nothing but a black hole. There was no light in the canyon whatsoever, only darkness. I told Tom, the gym teacher, that if we abseil the first rock, we're going to have to go all the way through. There would be no turning back. After a moment of hesitation, he replied, "Yeah, let's go." As we were descending into the black abyss, I felt different. It was a completely different experience than what we had encountered earlier that day. Specifically, my senses were very alert and I was just aware of everything. Even though we were surrounded by darkness, I knew the canyon by heart and could visualize where each rock and crevice was on the path. Although we could not see, we listened very carefully to understand how the water stream was moving. We followed the current silently and only spoke to each other to detect the distance between our bodies. As our voices echoed against the rocks, we noted that it would be best to stay no more than 2 meters apart from each other. It was a great experience just being there in the dark with Tom. We, as humans, normally rely on our sight to guide us, but both Tom and I realized that instead, we could listen and feel our way through the canyon. We were tapping into and just relying on a different part of our brain. Due to our new enhanced state of mind, we were able to make alterations to help us continue to stay alert. It just was all natural. A conditioned mind can cause narrowed perception, especially when only focusing on one sense and rarely using the others. Also, it's not about simply using them, it's about forming your entire perception through those other senses. Subsequently, you can begin to see the world in a different light. Tom and I discovered this as we spoke during our progression through the canyon. Everything was going smoothly, and we were really enjoying ourselves. The water was no longer cold as I had adapted by now, and my senses were sharp. As Tom and I followed the current, our surroundings emitted a tranquil feeling. We had just arrived at a crucial spot in the canyon, and though we were in the dark, we weren't blind. We found ourselves on a rock that the only way for us to get down was to jump. Now, if we jumped too far, we would slam into boulders. Luckily, I knew exactly what to do. I made some calculations in my head and just was ready to jump. Tom, on the other hand, wasn't as familiar with the terrain, so I thought it would be best to give him explicit instructions. Listen very carefully to where I enter the water. That way, you know how far and how hard you have to push off the wall when you do it yourself. He nodded, with a little hesitation, but he told me he understood. Since there is no light, he would have to listen very carefully to the sound of my feet as they enter the water. His hearing would have to be sharp and model that of a submarine's radar. He would have to trust me if this was going to work. Without any further delay, I jumped. After a large splash and submerging a few feet under the water, I took 2 strokes to bring me up on the slippery surface. "Tom, did you hear the distance?" "Yes," he answered. I could still sense the hesitation in his voice, but he was now determined to jump. There was no other way. A few seconds later, I heard him take a step and then leap into the darkness. He entered the water right next to me and surfaced a moment later. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," Tom said with a relieved tone. His trust in me and the way he surrendered to the situation is what ultimately led him to success. He could not have done it otherwise. Letting go of his anxiety and freeing himself from hesitation was also extremely helpful. Obstacles in life consume energy. And because Tom and I were able to overcome those obstacles in our way, we experienced a new type of energy. We felt powerful and full of vigor as we continued on. As we approached the final part of the canyon, moonlight began to peek through the rocky walls. It was a beautiful sight as we began to regain our vision and realize what we had just accomplished. A few minutes later, we were out of the canyon and stood motionless in the valley. Our minds were at peace and we felt immense joy. Tom and I embraced each other without saying a word. We had met a great challenge and conquered it. By the time we reached where we were staying for the night, the students and the professors had already fallen asleep. I laid myself down in the bed, closed my eyes, and slept like a rock. The next day, I took the group to another canyon in a warmer area. In the Pyrenees, the climate just varies all over the place. It could be very wet and cold in one area, while very hot and dry in another. It all changes. So one must adapt to new surroundings, just as Tom and I had to adapt to master that canyon without light.